The house stood at the edge of town, its weathered wooden planks sagging under the weight of time. The paint, once a cheerful yellow, had peeled away to reveal gray, rotting wood beneath. The windows were clouded with dust, and the garden, once vibrant with flowers, was now a tangle of weeds. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old age and neglect, a faint mustiness that clung to the walls and furniture. In a small, dimly lit room at the back of the house, an elderly woman lay in bed, her frail body barely making a dent in the thin mattress. Her name was Margaret, though no one had called her by her full name in years. To the townsfolk, she was simply Old Maggie, the woman who had raised 5 children on her own after her husband's untimely death. But to her children, she was little more than a burden, a reminder of a past they had long since left behind. Margaret's children were successful by all outward appearances. The eldest, Robert, was a wealthy businessman with a sprawling estate in the city. Elizabeth, the second eldest, was a renowned surgeon, her face often gracing the covers of medical journals. Michael, the middle child, was a high-powered lawyer, known for his sharp tongue and ruthless tactics. Sarah, the second youngest, was a celebrated artist, her work displayed in galleries across the country. And then there was Daniel, the youngest, who had followed in his siblings' footsteps, carving out a comfortable life as a software engineer. But for all their success, they shared one common trait: selfishness. They rarely visited their mother, and when they did, their stays were brief and cold, filled with thinly veiled resentment. To them, Margaret was a relic of a past they had outgrown, a reminder of the sacrifices she had made to raise them, sacrifices they had no intention of repaying. Before we continue, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. On this particular day, Daniel had come to visit, though visit was a generous term. He had stayed for less than an hour, his eyes darting to his phone every few minutes, as if counting down the seconds until he could leave. Margaret had tried to engage him in conversation, her voice weak but filled with a quiet desperation. She asked about his job, his life, his dreams, but his answers were curt, his tone dismissive. As he stood to leave, Margaret reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against his sleeve. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He paused, glancing down at her with a mixture of impatience and guilt. "What is it, Mom?" Her eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with emotion, locked onto his. "You'll regret this one day," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Daniel froze, a flicker of unease crossing his face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same cold detachment he had shown throughout his visit. "Don't be dramatic, Mom," he said, pulling his arm away. "I'll see you next month." And with that, he was gone, the sound of the front door closing echoing through the empty house. Margaret lay back against her pillows, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the last rays of sunlight were fading behind the trees. She knew her time was running out, but more than that, she knew her children's hearts had grown cold, too cold to see the truth of what they were doing. As the room grew darker, Margaret closed her eyes, her mind filled with memories of a time when her children had been small, their laughter filling the house, their love unconditional. But those days were long gone, replaced by a silence that was almost suffocating. And yet, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought lingered in her mind: they'll regret this one day. It was a warning, a prophecy, a mother's final plea to the children who had forgotten her. But whether they would listen, or whether it was already too late, remained to be seen. The siblings gathered in Robert's sprawling city estate, a stark contrast to their mother's crumbling home. The room was opulent, with high ceilings, polished hardwood floors, and a chandelier that cast a warm, golden glow over the space. But the atmosphere was far from warm. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes from a shared burden no one wants to bear. Robert sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled as he surveyed his siblings. Elizabeth sat to his right, her arms crossed and her expression tight. Michael was pacing by the window, his sharp features twisted into a scowl. Sarah sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, while Daniel, the youngest, fidgeted nervously in his seat. "We need to talk about Mom," Robert began, his voice calm but authoritative. "She's becoming a problem." Elizabeth scoffed, rolling her eyes. "A problem? That's an understatement. Do you know how much it's costing to keep her in that house? The medical bills alone are astronomical." Michael stopped pacing and turned to face the group. "And let's not forget the time we're wasting. I can't keep taking days off work to deal with her. It's affecting my career." Sarah sighed, her voice soft but laced with frustration. "I know it's hard, but she's our mother. We can't just abandon her." "Why not?" Elizabeth shot back, her tone icy. "She's already abandoned us in every way that matters. She's a shell of the woman she used to be. What's the point of keeping her around?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between his siblings. "I don't know. It just feels wrong. She's still our mom." Robert leaned forward, his expression grim. "Listen, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I think I've come up with a solution. A permanent one." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Robert. Even Michael stopped pacing, his sharp gaze fixed on his eldest brother. "What are you suggesting?" Elizabeth asked, her voice low. Robert hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Then he spoke, his voice steady but devoid of emotion. "We bury her. In the woods. We'll say she passed away naturally. No one will question it." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Michael let out a harsh laugh, breaking the silence. "You're serious?" he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You want us to bury her alive?" Robert's expression didn't change. "It's the most practical solution. She's already as good as gone. This way, we can move on with our lives." Sarah's face paled, her hands trembling in her lap. "Robert, you can't be serious. This is monstrous." Elizabeth, however, seemed to be considering it. "It's not the worst idea," she said slowly. "It would solve all our problems at once." Daniel shook his head, his voice rising in panic. "No, we can't do this. She's our mother. How can you even think about something like this?" Robert's gaze hardened as he turned to Daniel. "Do you have a better idea? Because if you do, I'd love to hear it." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around the room, hoping to find support from one of his siblings, but their faces were cold, unyielding. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I'm in. Let's get it over with." Elizabeth nodded. "Me too." Sarah hesitated, her eyes filled with conflict, but eventually, she nodded as well. I guess it's for the best." Daniel stared at them in horror, his heart pounding in his chest. "You can't be serious. This is insane." Robert stood, his expression final. "It's decided. We'll do it tonight." That night, under the cover of darkness, the siblings drove to the remote woods on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath their feet as they carried their mother's frail, unconscious body deeper into the forest. They had drugged her tea earlier that evening, ensuring she wouldn't wake during the process. But as they began to dig the shallow grave, a strange unease settled over them. The silence of the forest felt oppressive, and the faint rustling of leaves seemed to carry whispers, whispers that sounded eerily like their mother's voice. "You'll regret this one day." The words echoed in their minds, faint but unmistakable. Robert paused, his shovel hovering midair as he glanced around the darkened woods. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. Elizabeth shook her head, though her face was pale. "It's just the wind. Keep digging." But the words lingered, growing louder with each passing moment. "You'll regret this one day." Michael dropped his shovel, his hands trembling. "I can't do this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Robert turned to him, his expression fierce. We're not backing out now. Keep digging. As they lowered their mother into the shallow grave, her frail body barely visible in the moonlight, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. You'll regret this one day. Daniel, his face streaked with tears, hesitated as he picked up a handful of dirt. This is wrong, he whispered. This is so wrong. But no one listened. One by one, they began to shovel dirt over their mother's body, the sound of earth hitting earth drowning out the whispers, or so they thought. As they walked away, the forest fell silent once more. But the words lingered, echoing in their minds like a curse. You'll regret this one day. And deep in the ground, beneath the cold, unyielding earth, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. The forest was unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light filtering through the dense canopy of trees and casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. The siblings worked in silence, their shovels biting into the soft earth as they dug a shallow grave. The only sounds were the rhythmic scrape of metal against soil and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Margaret lay on the ground nearby, her frail body wrapped in a thin blanket. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and uneven, her face pale and gaunt in the moonlight. The siblings had drugged her tea earlier that evening, ensuring she wouldn't wake during the burial. But as they worked, a strange unease settled over them, a feeling that they were being watched, not by anyone living, but by the forest itself. Robert, the eldest, was the first to break the silence. Hurry up, he muttered, his voice tense. I don't want to be out here all night. Elizabeth, her face pale but determined, nodded in agreement. The sooner we finish this, the better. Michael, usually so confident, was uncharacteristically quiet. His hands trembled as he shoveled dirt, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to shift and move at the edges of his vision. Sarah, the most reluctant of the group, paused frequently, her face filled with conflict. This feels wrong, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What if she wakes up? Robert shot her a sharp look. She won't. We made sure of that. Now keep digging. Daniel, the youngest, stood apart from the others, his shovel lying forgotten at his feet. He stared at his mother's lifeless form, his heart pounding in his chest. We can't do this, he said, his voice trembling. She's our mother. This is murder. Robert turned on him, his eyes blazing with anger. If you don't have the stomach for this, then leave. But don't you dare judge the rest of us. We're doing what needs to be done. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He looked at his siblings, their faces cold and unyielding, and felt a surge of despair. He wanted to stop them, to scream at them to see reason, but he was paralyzed by fear and guilt. Finally, the grave was dug. It wasn't deep, just enough to conceal her body, but it would serve its purpose. The siblings gathered around Margaret, their faces pale and drawn in the moonlight. Robert was the first to move. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his hands rough and impersonal, and dragged her toward the grave. Elizabeth and Michael followed, each taking an arm, while Sarah hesitated before reluctantly grabbing her legs. Daniel stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. As they lowered her into the shallow grave, a sudden, unnatural chill swept through the forest. The air grew heavy, and the rustling of leaves seemed to take on a sinister tone. The siblings exchanged uneasy glances, their breath visible in the suddenly cold air. What was that? Michael asked, his voice shaky. It's just the wind, Elizabeth snapped, though her face betrayed her unease. But then, as they began to shovel dirt over their mother's body, a faint sound reached their ears, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. The earth will remember. The words sent a chill down their spines. Robert froze, his shovel hovering midair, as he glanced around the darkened forest. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice tense. Elizabeth shook her head, though her face was pale. It's nothing. Just keep digging. But the whisper came again, louder this time. The earth will remember. Michael dropped his shovel, his hands trembling. I can't do this, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Robert turned to him, his expression fierce. We're not backing out now. Keep digging. As they continued to shovel dirt over their mother's body, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The earth will remember. Sarah paused, her face streaked with tears. This is wrong, she whispered. This is so wrong. But no one listened. One by one, they continued to bury their mother, the sound of earth hitting earth drowning out the whispers, or so they thought. As they walked away, the forest fell silent once more. But the words lingered, echoing in their minds like a curse. The earth will remember. And deep in the ground, beneath the cold, unyielding earth, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. The days following the burial were anything but peaceful for the siblings. What they had hoped would be a clean break from their past quickly turned into a living nightmare. Strange events began to plague them, each more unsettling than the last, as if the forest itself had borne witness to their crime and was determined to make them pay. Robert, the eldest and the mastermind behind the plan, was the first to experience the consequences. It started with whispers, faint, almost imperceptible, but always there, lingering at the edges of his hearing. At first, he dismissed them as stress, the weight of his guilt manifesting in his mind. But then the shadows began to move. Late one night, as he sat in his study reviewing documents, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye. He turned, expecting to see nothing, but there, in the dim light, stood a figure, a frail, hunched silhouette that bore an uncanny resemblance to his mother. He blinked, and it was gone. The nightmares came next. Vivid, horrifying dreams of his mother clawing her way out of the grave, her eyes burning with a cold, otherworldly light. She would reach for him, her voice a raspy whisper. The earth remembers. Robert woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, but the whispers followed him into the waking world. Elizabeth, the surgeon, prided herself on her rationality. She had always been the most pragmatic of the siblings, the one who could detach herself from emotion and focus on the task at hand. But even she couldn't ignore the strange occurrences that began to disrupt her life. It started in the operating room. During a routine procedure, she thought she saw her mother's face reflected in the stainless steel tray. The shock caused her hand to slip, nearly costing the patient their life. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost like the hum of fluorescent lights. But they grew louder, more insistent, until she could no longer ignore them. The earth remembers. Elizabeth tried to rationalize it, blaming stress and lack of sleep, but the nightmares made it impossible. Every night, she dreamed of her mother standing at the foot of her bed, her frail hand pointing accusingly. You buried me alive. Michael, the lawyer, was used to being in control, but the strange events that followed the burial left him feeling powerless. It began with his clients. One by one, they dropped him, citing unprofessional behavior and erratic decisions. Then came the shadows, dark, shifting figures that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The final blow came during a high-profile case. As he stood before the judge, ready to deliver his closing argument, he froze. The whispers, which had been a constant presence in the back of his mind, suddenly grew deafening. The earth remembers. He stumbled over his words, his confident demeanor crumbling as the courtroom watched in stunned silence. The case was lost, and with it, his reputation. Sarah, the artist, had always been the most sensitive of the siblings. The guilt of what they had done weighed heavily on her, and the strange events only made it worse. Her paintings, once vibrant and full of life, turned dark and twisted. She tried to paint other subjects, but her brush seemed to have a mind of its own, always returning to the same image, a frail, hunched figure emerging from the earth, her eyes filled with a cold, unyielding light. The whispers followed her everywhere, growing louder with each passing day. The earth remembers. One night, as she stood before her latest painting, she heard a voice, clear and unmistakable. You can still make it right. Daniel, the youngest, had been the most reluctant to participate in the burial. His guilt and fear had only grown since that night, and the strange events that plagued his siblings left him terrified. But unlike the others, he began to hear a different voice, a softer, more pleading voice. You can still make it right. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a desperate attempt to ease his guilt. But the voice grew louder, more insistent, until he could no longer ignore it. One night, as he lay in bed, the voice came again, clear and unmistakable. You can still make it right. Daniel sat up, his heart pounding. He knew what he had to do. The siblings, once so united in their greed and selfishness, were now isolated, each consumed by their own guilt and fear. The whispers, the shadows, the nightmares, they were all connected, a reminder of the crime they had committed. And as the youngest, Daniel, prepared to face the truth, the words echoed in his mind, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. You can still make it right. But whether it was too late, or whether the earth would ever forgive them, remained to be seen. The forest was eerily quiet as Daniel made his way back to the shallow grave. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. His heart pounded in his chest, each step heavier than the last, as the voice in his mind grew louder, more insistent. You can still make it right. He carried a shovel in his trembling hands, the weight of it a constant reminder of what he was about to do. The guilt had been eating away at him since the night of the burial, and the strange events that had plagued his siblings only deepened his fear. He couldn't ignore the voice any longer. He had to know the truth. When he reached the grave, he paused, his breath visible in the cold night air. The earth was undisturbed, the shallow mound of dirt barely visible in the dim light. But something felt different, something felt alive. With a deep breath, Daniel began to dig. The sound of the shovel biting into the earth was deafening in the silence, each scoop of dirt bringing him closer to the truth. His hands shook, his mind racing with fear and hope, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. As he reached the bottom of the grave, his shovel struck something soft. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, before dropping to his knees and frantically brushing away the dirt with his hands. And then he saw her. Margaret lay in the grave, her frail body pale and cold, but her chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. She was alive. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Her eyes fluttered open, and Daniel recoiled in shock. They burned with a strange, otherworldly light, a cold, unyielding glow that seemed to pierce his very soul. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with a quiet intensity. "You came back." Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he gently lifted her out of the grave, his hands trembling with a mixture of relief and fear. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Margaret's frail hand reached up to touch his face, her fingers cold but gentle. "The earth remembers," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But forgiveness is still possible." Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. But Margaret didn't answer. Her eyes fluttered closed, her breathing growing shallow once more. Daniel held her close, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave her here. As he carried her out of the forest, the whispers that had haunted him for days grew softer, fading into the night. But the words lingered in his mind, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. The earth remembers, but forgiveness is still possible. And as Daniel disappeared into the night, the forest fell silent once more, the shadows shifting and moving as if alive. The earth remembered, and it was watching. The story of Margaret and her children is a chilling reminder of the consequences of greed, neglect, and moral decay. It challenges us to reflect on our own relationships and responsibilities, urging us to prioritize compassion and empathy over selfishness and ambition. At the same time, the story's supernatural elements and unresolved mysteries leave a lasting impression, inviting us all to ponder the boundaries between life and death, the power of the natural world, and the possibility of redemption. In the end, the story is not just a tale of horror, but a profound exploration of the human condition, one that lingers in the mind long after the final page is turned. Thank you for watching. Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next story.